The fine bone china plate under my fork cost $80, and I was the one who paid for it. We were at Sunday dinner in Lake Oswego, the same weekly ritual, the same suffocating dining room that smelled of expensive beeswax and lavender furniture wax. My younger sister, Vivienne, raised her crystal wine glass, catching the amber glow of the chandelier. She smiled, but it was a cold, practiced expression, the kind she used right before she struck. To Nadine, Vivienne said, her voice dripping with a soft, patronizing sweetness that made my chest tighten. Her eyes flickered over to our parents before anchoring back to mine. It's just so clear as daylight. Look at you. No husband, no kids, just those brutal, endless shifts. Where is the actual legacy, Nadine? Oh, right, you don't have one. The silence that followed wasn't a sudden shock. It was worse. It was a polite, quiet chuckle from my mother and a slow, approving smirk from my father, retired federal judge Arthur Foster. They sat there at the head of a table I had kept under their feet for 7 years, treating my entire existence as a harmless family joke. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. For 84 months, my hazard pay as a tactical paramedic had quietly covered their toxic debts, paid their underwater mortgage, and kept their manufactured upper-class illusion from collapsing into the dirt. And now, sitting in the house I had saved, I was the punchline. I didn't yell, I didn't break down or let my hands shake. When you spend your life patching arterial bleeds in the back of a moving trauma rig, you learn to lock your heart rate at a flat, analytical baseline. You swallow the heat and look strictly at the vitals. They saw a tired civilian failure in a gray blazer. They had no idea they were looking at an operator who was already calculating the trajectory of the countermeasure. I set my spoon down. The tiny, metallic clink against the ceramic plate was the loudest sound in the room. My mother's smile faded slightly. Arthur sat up a bit straighter in his high-backed chair. "Where's your money, Vivienne?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, cutting right through the quiet amusement of the room. Vivienne's face flickered, her glass hovering midair. "What?" "Your money," I repeated, looking her dead in the eye. "For your rent, your clothes, your phone, where is it?" "Oh, right, I've been underwriting your life until today." I turned my head just a fraction, letting my gaze lock onto my father. "All of you." I stood up, the violent scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor, breaking the final piece of their stage-managed reality. I picked up my briefcase, my fingers wrapping around the handle with absolute, unyielding certainty. They thought they had successfully cornered a compliant dependent. They had no idea about the thick manila folder waiting in my bag, or the forged signature I had discovered on a hidden $150,000 loan sheet just 3 days ago. "Nadine, you sit back down," Arthur commanded, reaching for the booming courtroom baritone that used to freeze my blood. "You will not walk away from this family." I didn't look back as I reached the heavy oak door. The spring had reached its absolute limit, and the release was going to tear their entire house of cards down to the foundation. "Watch me," I said, and stepped out into the cold Oregon rain. The heavy oak door didn't slam behind me. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a cinematic exit. Instead, I just let the latch click into place, quiet and final, cutting off the sudden, defensive shouting that had started to rise from Arthur's throat the second I turned my back. The cold Oregon rain hit me before I even reached the bottom step of the porch. It wasn't a downpour, just that relentless, freezing Pacific Northwest drizzle that blurs the edges of everything and gets into your bones if you stand still too long. I didn't stand still. I walked straight down the gravel driveway, my boots crunching rhythmically in the dark, my fingers locked so tightly around the handle of my tactical briefcase that the metal edges bit into my calluses. I got into my car, pulled the door shut, and just sat there in the dark. The headlights caught the manicured boxwood hedges of the Lake Oswego estate, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet grass. The engine idled with a low, steady vibration that felt grounding after the suffocating stillness of that dining room. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, but inside my chest, the rhythm was all wrong. My heart rate wasn't spiking. Years of working trauma rigs under the midnight lights of the Puget Sound docks teach you how to override your own adrenaline. But it felt heavy, like a piston forcing its way through thick oil. I looked at the passenger seat. The thick manila folder was peeking out of my kit bag, its edges slightly frayed from the hours I'd spent cross-referencing routing numbers at my kitchen table in Seattle. Seeing it sitting there, completely static, made the reality of what I had just done settle in. I had officially cut the wire. For 7 years, my life had been structured around a series of invisible, automated numbers. Every first of the month, $1,200 would quietly exit my checking account and slide into Arthur's ledger to cover an estate mortgage they couldn't afford on a ghost consulting business. Then came the frantic, late-night text messages from Vivienne about a car insurance lapse, or a casual mention from my mother about an experimental cardiac treatment that her premium policy didn't quite cover. I had become an uncredited utility company in their minds, a faceless line item that kept the lights on so they could continue their upper-crust social performance without ever having to look at the cost. They called me the responsible one. They used the word like a compliment, but it always felt like a job description I hadn't applied for. It was a convenient label that allowed them to overlook the fact that I was pulling 60-hour shifts, scrubbing the copper-tang smell of blood out from under my fingernails, and skipping vacations just to ensure their colonial illusion didn't slide into foreclosure. I shifted the car into drive and let the vehicle roll out past the iron security gates. The headlights swept across the peeling paint on the north side of the house, a detail I'd made a note to hire a contractor for next month. I caught myself checking the mental list and forced my foot down on the accelerator, forcing the car onto the dark, rain-slicked blacktop of the state route. No more. The bank was officially closed. The drive north toward the I-5 corridor was 40 minutes of absolute, unpunctuated silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't want the synthetic noise. I just watched the white lane markers flash past in the dark, a hypnotic sequence of lines that mirrored the cold arithmetic currently running through my brain. $84,000. That was the raw metric of my compliance. I could have bought a condominium closer to the water, initialized a real retirement portfolio, or taken that 2-week surfing trip to the rugged coast of Costa Rica I'd been putting off since my late 20s. Instead, I had bought 7 years of polite smirks and an underlying, pervasive sense of isolation. By the time the green highway signs for the Washington border appeared through the mist, the numbness began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear focus. Arthur's final command inside the house, that booming, authoritative patriarch routine he'd perfected over 30 years on the federal bench, kept replaying in my head. He had tried to treat me like a hostile witness in his own living room, demanding an apology as if his title could erase the signature I'd found on the HELOC application. He didn't realize that, when you spend your life managing open airways in the back of a moving ambulance, you lose your respect for titles. An arterial bleed doesn't care if you're a judge or an influencer. It only responds to physics, data, and direct pressure. I had spent 7 years letting them control the narrative, letting them pretend that my career was just a gritty, lower-class phase I was going through before I settled down. As I crossed the bridge over the Columbia River, the dark expanse of the water reflecting the industrial lights of the shipping yards below, my phone lit up on the console. The caller ID displayed my mother's home number. I didn't silence it immediately. I just watched it flash against the dark dashboard, a small rectangle of bright, disruptive light. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. I let it run its course until it dropped into voicemail, the silence reclaiming the cabin of the car. My hand didn't even drift toward the screen. The soldier's stoicism wasn't a choice tonight, it was an operational requirement. They were going to try every lever they had, the emotional manipulation, the medical guilt, the shifting of blame, to force me back into the box they had built for me. They had no idea that I had already changed the locks. The morning after the cutoff arrived with no sound at all. I sat at the small wooden table in my Seattle apartment, my hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the gray, flat light of the Puget Sound crawl across the floorboards. This place was my decompression chamber. It was small, sparse, and smelled of medical-grade antiseptic and dark roast. No clutter, no family portraits on the mantel, just a clean perimeter. The mechanical drip, drip of the coffee maker was the only rhythm in the room until the counter lit up. My phone face up on the laminate. The screen flickered, a silent, rapid assault of notifications cutting through the quiet. I didn't pick it up. I just watched it vibrate against the wood. The first was a push notification from my banking portal. An administrative hold had been placed on my primary checking account, the one completely uncoupled from the Lake Oswego transfers, the repository for my actual civilian salary as a tactical paramedic. The text under the red alert flag mentioned a suspected identity discrepancy linked directly to the co-signed property loan. Arthur had pulled a lever. Before the courts even opened on Monday morning, he had reached into the commercial lending system to freeze my liquidity. It was a classic judicial extraction maneuver. He was trying to starve me out, to cut off my supply lines before I could organize a legal defense. 10 minutes later, the professional hit landed. An urgent email notification from the administrative chief of my trauma unit appeared on my tablet. Nadine Foster, your active status on the tactical response team has been temporarily suspended pending an internal review of your psychiatric fitness for duty metrics. Attached to the electronic notice was a certified copy of a formal medical affidavit submitted directly by Judge Arthur Foster. He had taken my old medical insurance receipts from 5 years ago, copays I had paid for standard, post-deployment decompression counseling after my second tour, and deliberately reframed them to look like a documented history of severe, volatile mental instability. He wasn't just trying to win a financial dispute over an underwater colonial estate. He was executing a clinical erasure of my identity. He was dismantling every pillar of my independent life, attempting to strip away my professional autonomy until I had no choice but to crawl back to Lake Oswego as a broken, dependent child who required his legal guardianship. I stood up, walked slowly into the bathroom, and turned on the harsh overhead vanity lights. I stared directly at my reflection in the mirror. My skin looked pale against the dark collar of my gray blazer. The deep circles under my eyes were a physical ledger of the sleepless nights I'd spent holding up the floor for them, but my pupils were completely steady. No panic, no shaking. I pulled up my secure credit monitoring dashboard on my encrypted personal device to check the active status of that fraudulent $150,000 loan. I hit refresh. The digital data shifted, and a chilling twist appeared on the screen. The entire historical record of the Lake Oswego home equity line of credit had been completely scrubbed from my consumer dashboard. The trade line hadn't been settled to zero, and the balance hadn't been closed. The entire file had been hidden, masked by a high-level security clearance block that should never exist for a standard residential property loan. My father's reach was extending far beyond the local Portland courthouse network. He was moving invisible pieces in the deep shadows of the regulatory system, and a cold sense of mystery entered the room. A retired federal judge could not single-handedly wipe a commercial banking record from a national credit registry. Someone else in the shadows was actively helping him keep that file locked behind a cryptographic wall. My mind dragged me back to the sensory memories of Kandahar. The acrid smell of burnt magnesium, the blinding 90-degree heat, and the heavy weight of my trauma shears cutting through the crumpled fuselage of that downed Blackhawk. The Shadow Ops operator I had dragged from the burning cockpit, the one whose face was masked by soot, had tightly gripped my calloused wrist and whispered that highly classified coordinate string. The blue compass is broken, but the North Star is still at 045. The uniquely notched titanium firing pin he had slipped into my combat pocket was still locked inside the olive drab Pelican case under my bed. Arthur's forged loan money wasn't lost in a random offshore trading account. The timing of the security block mapped perfectly to the exact intelligence sector connected to that rescue mission. The realization hit me with the force of a concussive blast. My father isn't just trying to erase his daughter to save his house. He is acting as a legal fixer for a corrupt network that reaches far deeper into my own military past than I ever imagined. The file wasn't locked to protect Arthur from me. It was locked to keep me from realizing that the man I saved in the desert is the exact person my father is currently trying to buy off with my stolen money. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my briefcase, and locked the latches with 2 sharp, definitive metallic clicks. I didn't send a text. I didn't call to demand answers. Silence was my only weapon until the data was organized. I put on my coat, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the gray Seattle mist. It was time to find someone who could help me tear down his wall. The secure records office of the Commercial Lending Bank in downtown Portland felt less like a financial institution and more like an archive of slow, deliberate executions. The room was cold, subterranean, and stripped of natural light. It was illuminated only by the sterile hum of fluorescent tubes that made the gray linoleum floors look like the deck of a military vessel. I sat across a laminate desk from a low-level compliance officer who refused to make direct eye contact with me. He kept his gaze anchored to his terminal, his fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against his keyboard. He knew exactly who my father was. In this city, the name Judge Arthur Foster was stamped on the foundational masonry of the legal system. To challenge a document bearing his mark was to suggest that the architecture itself was rotting. "Ms. Foster," the officer said, his voice dropping into a cautious, hushed monotone that barely carried across the desk. A national security non-disclosure wrapper is an extraordinary administrative measure for a standard residential asset. My authorization parameters do not permit me to print the digital metadata of this file. To do so would trigger an automated security alert to the Regional Oversight Committee. I did not blink. I did not offer a polite, pleading smile, nor did I attempt to negotiate. I leaned forward slightly, placing my calloused palms flat on the cold laminate. I deliberately dropped my heart rate into the calm, rhythmic zone of a tactical operator, managing a critical airway block. "I am not asking you to violate a federal mandate, officer," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the chilling clarity of a scalpel cutting through surgical tape. "I am instructing you to comply with a priority records request filed by an active military asset under the Financial Privacy Act of 1978. If that digital terminal does not display the original signature upload page within 30 seconds, my independent legal counsel will file an immediate emergency petition for administrative obstruction with the state bar. Your name will be the first line item on that docket." The compliance officer swallowed hard, his collar suddenly looking too tight for his throat. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped his mouse, executed a sequence of high-level overrides, and turned the heavy monitor 45 degrees toward my side of the desk. "The system will only allow the encrypted document view for 90 seconds before logging me out," he whispered, staring at the floor. "Look fast." I pulled myself closer to the glowing screen, treating the digital application exactly like a trauma scene that needed to be forensically triaged. My eyes bypassed the boilerplate financial text, the inflated asset valuations, and the fabricated income registries, dropping directly to the bottom of the final page. The signature read Nadine Foster. The sensory anchor hit me with the physical force of a concussive blast. The capital N was magnificent, a flawless, sweeping, elegant loop that Arthur used when signing my childhood report cards, the exact same loop he used when authorizing my high school graduation documents. It was a signature I had looked at my entire life for validation. But as my eyes traced the remaining letters, the forensic reality exposed the crime. At the tail end of the name, where the ink meets the digital compression line, the strokes become jagged, trembling, and wildly uneven. It was the physical manifestation of an aging hand betraying an internal panic. It was the visual, undeniable proof that the all-powerful federal judge was terrified of getting caught while writing it. He didn't just passively authorize a document. He sat in his smoke-filled, leather-bound study, gripped his expensive fountain pen, and actively committed a felony against his own daughter's future. But as I scrolled down to look at the digital metadata log at the very bottom of the screen, the true twist of the chapter snapped shut like a steel trap. The cash payout of the $150,000 home equity line of credit wasn't rooted into the estate's domestic checking account to repair the plumbing or cover the underwater mortgage. The electronic routing log indicates that the entire lump sum was split into 3 distinct, non-traceable wire transfers, routed directly into an offshore commercial clearing account in the Cayman Islands that went completely dark 3 weeks ago. Arthur didn't steal my credit to preserve the family home. He stole it to liquidate his remaining domestic liquidity. The compliance officer's terminal suddenly screen flashes black as the 90-second security timer expires, leaving my reflection staring back at me in the dark glass. The mystery was no longer about a family dispute. It was about a calculated flight strategy. The transition from a quiet, bureaucratic shadow war to an active, scorched-earth digital offensive occurred precisely at 400 on the 1st of the month. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my tactical response vehicle, the heavy diesel engine idling low and steady beneath my boots, watching the cold, gray morning mist roll off the black waters of the Puget Sound. The dashboard clock flipped to the hour, and my mobile device instantly transformed into a weaponized piece of glass, vibrating violently against the console. The automated $1,200 family support transfer had officially failed to clear Arthur's account. The spring, coiled tight behind 7 years of silent, invisible submission, began its rapid, violent release. The first digital payload arrived at 4:01 from my mother, Eleanor. It was a masterclass in performative psychological manipulation, engineered specifically to trigger my combat-conditioned guilt. "Nadine, sweetheart, the bank just issued an automatic default alert on the primary estate mortgage. Your father is in an absolute state on the floor of his study. We know the horrific pressure and the lingering trauma of your recent deployment shifts is causing you to lose your grip on reality. You are being too sensitive, dear. She was only joking at dinner. Please, let us handle the routing numbers before you destroy this family. Call me immediately." At 4:15, Arthur's digital footprint landed. There were no sweet prefaces, no references to my mental health, and no pleas for communication. It was a blunt, imperial decree that carried the absolute weight of a federal mandate. "I am not playing this game, Nadine. Your ungrateful little stunt ends now. You have exactly 1 hour to contact the commercial loan officer and authorize the liquidity release to the estate account. This is not a request. Fix it." I did not reply to a single character. I sat perfectly still in the dark cabin of the rig, watching the blue strobe lights of a nearby harbor patrol boat slice through the thick industrial fog of the shipping docks. In the field, when an aggressive, hostile force begins firing blindly into the dark tree line, it means they have completely lost their line of sight. They are panicking because their primary target has gone completely dark. Then, at 4:45, a frantic, high-pitched voicemail notification from my younger sister, Vivienne, dropped. Her voice was a breathless, theatrical shriek that cuts through the silence of my vehicle. "Nadine, Izzy, you're ruining my life. My landlord is literally standing outside my door right now, threatening immediate eviction because my rent check bounced. He's being an absolute psycho and screaming at me. You promised me you'd cover this month. Why are you ignoring me? Hello." I opened the digital Fallout folder on my tactical tablet, pulling up the itemized ledger of Vivienne's heavily subsidized lifestyle. I cross-referenced the specific commercial name of the landlord. She texted me weeks ago with the electronic routing history I secured from the bank records. The logical connection paid off with a cold, geometric irony that made my stomach clench. The electronic routing numbers did not map to a residential property management firm or an upscale apartment complex in Oregon. The transaction path leads directly to a high-end, boutique luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills, California. The twist hit with the force of an oncoming vehicle. Vivienne isn't facing immediate homelessness. She is actively leasing a $90,000 European sports car under a fraudulent commercial shell account, entirely funded by my emergency tactical hazard pay. She isn't a drowning sibling requiring an economic lifeline. She is a high-yield asset liquidation pipeline, fully authorized and protected by Arthur to bleed my bank accounts dry to maintain their upper-crust social profile while he hides the total collapse of his own judicial empire. I locked the tablet back inside my Pelican case. They believed they were holding my identity hostage behind a wall of manufactured crises. They had no idea that every single frantic text message was simply adding data points to the legal ammunition I am about to deploy. By Friday, the psychological counteroffensive escalated from digital harassment to an institutional lockdown. When I clocked in for my midday trauma shift at the Puget Sound port facility, my unit supervisor avoided my eyes, his face exceptionally tight as he slid a formal, notarized document across the desk. Arthur had bypassed our family dynamic entirely and struck directly at my livelihood. He had filed a formal affidavit with the Municipal Emergency Services Board, alleging that my recent combat tour had left me with unmanageable, volatile PTSD that made me an immediate psychiatric liability to civilian patients. My active status on the tactical response team was suspended, effective immediately, pending a full evaluation by a state-appointed medical board, a board where Arthur's former judicial colleagues happened to sit as senior advisors. He didn't just try to freeze my bank accounts. He had cut off my ability to earn a living, attempting to strip away my professional autonomy until I was forced to crawl back to the Lake Oswego estate for survival. I walked out of the building, my briefcase tight in my hand. I drove straight to a low-profile, subterranean coffee shop in a working-class district of Tacoma, far outside the geographic and political boundary of Arthur's judicial network. Elena Vance was already waiting in a corner booth, surrounded by printed federal financial registries. "He's moving faster than I anticipated, Nadine," Elena said, sliding a fresh document toward me. We traced the restricted HELOC file. The Washington, D.C. protective order that locked your signature page wasn't issued to protect a bank asset. It was filed under a national security non-disclosure wrapper. I leaned in, the copper smell of my untouched black coffee mirroring the metallic tension in my chest. "Explain." 6 months ago, the exact week Arthur forged your name on that $150,000 loan, a federal corruption probe began investigating a dark money pipeline linking retired judges to black-budget defense contractors. Elena whispered, her fingers tracing the redacted lines. Arthur wasn't investing in offshore accounts. He was buying a non-extradition immunity shield, and he used your clean military record and forged signature to validate the transaction profile. The connection to my past snapped shut like a tactical trap. The Shadow Ops operator I had pulled from the burning Blackhawk in Kandahar. The man who whispered the broken compass coordinates and slipped the notched titanium pin into my pocket was the primary investigator targeting that exact corrupt network before his bird was brought down. My phone buzzed on the wooden table. A single group text from Arthur appeared on the screen, addressed to my mother, Vivienne, and me. "Come home Sunday, 1700 hours, we need to talk." It wasn't a dinner invitation. It was a formal summoning to a rigged courtroom. I looked at the manila folder in my lap, packed with 7 years of financial data, the itemized $84,000 ledger, and the certified evidence of his forgery. Arthur thought he had successfully cornered a broken, traumatized soldier. He had no idea that he had just cleared my airway, stripped away my remaining guilt, and forced me to treat him exactly like an active, hostile threat in an open combat zone. The drive down the I-5 corridor toward the Lake Oswego estate felt exactly like a tactical approach vector. The gray Oregon rain beat a relentless, military rhythm against my windshield, blurring the red taillights ahead of me. I am no longer Nadine the daughter, drowning in an ocean of parentified guilt. I am Nadine the operator, executing a cold, data-driven extraction. When I open the heavy oak door of the colonial house, the sensory assault is instantaneous. The air is thick with the oppressive scent of high-end English lavender furniture wax, premium cigar smoke, and cold roast lamb. It is a space designed to project unassailable institutional stability, a physical manifestation of Arthur's lifelong illusion. The family has arranged themselves in the living room like theatrical props on a stage. My mother, Elena, sits on the edge of the plush velvet couch, her hands twisting a damp tissue into shreds, her eyes fixed firmly on her knees. On the opposite end, Vivienne sits with her legs crossed, ostentatiously scrolling through her phone. It is a carefully rehearsed performance of total detachment. But the manic, unceasing bounce of her right ankle gives her away. Arthur sits at the apex of the room, anchored to his high-backed, leather judge's chair. The amber glow of a brass desk lamp reflects off his pristine mahogany side table, casting deep, dramatic shadows across his face. He doesn't rise. He simply looks down his nose at me, reaching for the booming, patriarchal baritone that used to freeze my blood. "Sit down, Nadine," he commands, gesturing toward a low, defenseless armchair opposite him. "I'm fine standing, Arthur," I say. My voice is shockingly flat, a calculated acoustic contrast to his theatrical depth. It is the exact, steady tone I use when telling a panicked patient to keep their eyes on me while I apply a tourniquet. Arthur's brow darkens, his chest expanding as he tries to fill the room with his traditional courtroom gravity. We have endured an incredibly difficult week because of your volatile behavior. Your mother's cardiac metrics are dangerously elevated. The psychological stress you have injected into this family is utterly unacceptable. He pauses, expecting me to stammer an excuse, to offer a defense, to shrink into the familiar mold of the ungrateful child. I give him absolutely nothing. I stand perfectly still in the center of the Persian rug, my arms relaxed at my sides, my tactical briefcase anchored to my right hand. The silence stretching between us becomes heavy, pressurized, and toxic. "You will look at your sister," Arthur seethes, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl. "You will apologize to your mother for this unstable, erratic breakdown, and you will restore that bank routing transfer before the courts open tomorrow morning. This foolishness ends today." The spring is fully compressed. The tension of 7 years of invisible exploitation has reached its absolute limit. I step forward into the pool of light cast by his brass lamp, pop the heavy metallic latches of my briefcase, and pull out a thick manila folder. "I am not here as your daughter, Arthur," I say, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel slicing through wet canvas. "And I am certainly not here to participate in a rigged courtroom. I am here as the primary victim of federal financial fraud." I drop the folder onto the pristine mahogany desk. The heavy, concussive thwack of the paper shatters the stage-managed illusion of the room, instantly silencing his baritone. Vivienne's head snapped up from her phone, her mask of cool detachment vaporizing into a sharp, ugly sneer. "Wow," she laughed, her voice dripping with venom. "Look who finally found her backbone. You think you can just walk in here with your gritty little ambulance documents and lecture us? We are your family, Nadine. We are the only people who will ever love you. Without us, you are absolutely nothing." I did not look at her with anger. I look at her with the cold triage logic I use when evaluating a superficial flesh wound in the back of a moving rig. I reached into the manila folder, pulled out the itemized ledger of her Venmo history, and slid it across the table until it hit the glass screen of her phone with a sharp, definitive click. "You mock my career, Vivienne," I say, my tone terrifyingly level. "But you have lived off my hazard pay for 84 months. You are a 28-year-old woman, and you have had me underwriting your life like a second parent. And you didn't use that emergency cash for rent." I turn my head slightly, catching my mother's shifting, terrified gaze. "She used my tactical stipends to secure a $90,000 European sports car through a shell account in Beverly Hills, while this house was actively going under." Vivienne's face went from a flushed, defensive red to a hollow, pale white. Her mouth opens and closes, but no sound comes out. She looks down at the data sheets, completely neutralized by the unyielding geometry of the numbers. "Nadine, please," my mother whispers, her hand flying to her chest in a practiced, theatrical gesture of cardiac distress. "We only did what we had to do to protect the estate. The plumbing was going to burst. We didn't want to bother you while you were dealing with your issues from the deployment." "You didn't avoid bothering me, Mom," I say, looking at her directly until she flinches and breaks eye contact. "You stole from me. You counted on me being the good, silent soldier who would just keep bailing out the boat until I drowned." Arthur slams his fist onto the arm of his leather chair, rising to his full height in a desperate, final attempt to reclaim his territorial power. "That is enough. You are in my house. This is a ridiculous misunderstanding. A standard bank error. I am a retired federal officer of the law, and I will not be cross-examined by an ungrateful civilian child." I reach back into the folder and pull out the folded, certified copy of the HELOC application. I unfold it deliberately, holding it under the direct beam of his desk lamp. I point directly to the signature page at the bottom. "The bank's fraud division doesn't think it's a misunderstanding, Arthur," I say, my voice clear and cold as the rain outside. "This is your handwriting. This is your clumsy, shaky attempt to replicate my signature to secure $150,000 in dark money defense contractor assets. You spent 30 years sending people to federal penitentiaries for the exact felony you committed on this piece of paper." The color completely drains from Arthur's face. The great, imposing federal judge looks suddenly small, gray, and fragile under the harsh light of his own lamp. His mouth is open, but his legal vocabulary has been entirely stripped away. "Here is the baseline," I state, standing completely straight, looking him dead in the eyes. "You have exactly 30 days. I don't want your money because you don't have any. You have 30 days to get my name off that loan. Refinance it, liquidate your assets, or sell this house. You will clear my name from your fraud." "And if I don't?" Arthur whispers, his voice suddenly raspy, the low threat completely devoid of real power. "If you don't," I say, walking toward the heavy oak door and placing my hand firmly on the brass knob. My independent attorney files a formal, non-redacted report for grand larceny and forgery with the state police, the Bar Association, and the Federal Oversight Committee in Washington, D.C. I will gladly hand them the fallout data folder, the screenshots, and the metadata. I turn my back to them, looking out at the dark, wet driveway. "You counted on my silence to clean up your crimes, Arthur. Not this time." I step out into the cold Pacific Northwest air, closing the door quietly and firmly behind me. The spring has officially released its payload. The 2 weeks that followed my departure from the Lake Oswego estate were defined by a deafening, absolute silence. I returned to my Seattle apartment, a space that suddenly felt less like a tactical decompression chamber and more like a concrete bunker under siege. The frantic text streams from my mother, the imperial demands from Arthur, the hysterical shrieks from Vivienne, they all ceased instantly. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that blankets a valley just before a flash flood. I spent those 14 days navigating the psychological triggers of a deep-seated domestic conditioning. Every morning at 600, my eyes would snap open, my hand reaching instinctively for my phone, expecting the digital detonation. Nothing. I sat at my window for hours, drinking bitter black tea, watching the commercial container ships cut through the dark, choppy waters of the Puget Sound. The silence was a weaponized psychological counteroffensive. It was designed to make me doubt my own tactical assessment. Did I go too far? Am I actively destroying my family over a legal technicality? Am I the volatile, broken soldier Arthur claimed I was? In the field, when an enemy stops firing, they are either retreating or reloading a heavier battery. I kept my guard up, refusing to break cover, refusing to send a single text that could be interpreted as a tactical retreat. I forced myself to look strictly at the vitals: the $84,000 ledger, the forged signature, and the jagged tail line of the capital N. The breakthrough occurred on a rain-slicked Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table when my encrypted comms line lit up. It was Elena Vance. "Nadine, the pressure cooked him," Elena said, her voice carrying the cold satisfaction of a seasoned prosecutor. "Arthur didn't call your bluff. He couldn't risk the state bar or the Federal Oversight Committee cracking open that national security non-disclosure wrapper." I gripped my coffee mug, my heart rate steady. "What did he do?" "He went to the bank's fraud division privately," Elena explained. "He signed a full, formal confession admitting to the forgery to clear your name and absolve you of the $150,000 liability. He had to lay down his own gavel to prevent a criminal indictment. Your credit is pristine, Nadine. Your name is completely cleared." A profound, weightless vacuum filled my chest. The phantom weight of 7 years of invisible servitude evaporated in a single second. "But there is a structural casualty," Elena continued softly. "The bank isn't a family member. They don't operate on guilt. The moment Arthur confessed to the fraud, it violated the core acceleration clauses of both the primary mortgage and the HELOC. The lending institution has initiated an immediate, non-negotiable foreclosure on the Lake Oswego property. The estate is gone, Nadine. The house of cards has officially collapsed. 3 months passed before the dust finally settled on the ruins of the Foster family legacy. I used that time to execute a complete, non-negotiable operational reset, booking a flight to the rugged, untamed coast of Costa Rica. I spent 21 days learning to surf badly on aggressive Pacific breaks, letting the cold saltwater violently wash the lingering scent of English lavender wax, stale cigar smoke, and courtroom anxiety out of my pores. I was rebuilding my nervous system from the bedrock up, learning for the very first time what it felt like to exist entirely within my own perimeter. When I landed back in the Pacific Northwest, a text message from an unrecognized number was waiting on my secure device. Nadine, it's Mom. I am using a prepaid burner. We are in a small unit now. I am cooking tonight. Please, just one dinner before Vivienne leaves for the coast. The text didn't contain commands. It didn't weaponize a cardiac crisis, and it didn't imply a debt. It simply used the word please. I drove down to a decayed, industrial sector of Tacoma, navigating past brick warehouses and a flickering vacancy sign to find the complex. I didn't go out of a lingering sense of guilt, nor did I go seeking an apology. I went because a tactical operator always surveys the blast zone after an engagement. When my mother opened the door to the cramped, two-room apartment, the contrast was devastating. The suffocating luxury of the colonial estate was gone, replaced by the pungent smell of cheap boiling pasta and stale, uncarpeted air. Eleanor looked 10 years older, her hair uncolored at the roots, her wrists completely bare of her traditional gold bangles. But for the first time in my life, she offered me a real, tired smile that lacked an underlying motive. Arthur sat at a plastic card table in the corner, holding a crumpled newspaper. The high-backed leather judge's chair was gone. Without his architectural stage, he looked like an ordinary, fragile old man stripped entirely of his institutional robes. He didn't shout, he didn't command, and he didn't reach for his legal baritone. He simply offered a solemn, humbled nod. "Isabella," he said, using my middle name with a quiet respect he had never granted before. On a stained corduroy couch in the corner, Vivienne was taping a cardboard box shut. She was wearing a stiff, unwashed blue polyester polo shirt with a yellow Best Buy corporate logo stamped on the chest, her new, unshielded economic reality. Her hair was pulled back into a utilitarian ponytail, entirely devoid of social media filters or cosmetic masks. "Hey, Nadine," Vivienne said, her voice flat but remarkably free of her previous malice. My mother served spaghetti on white paper plates, and we ate in a heavy, awkward, but entirely honest silence. There were no stage-managed arrangements, no cruel jokes about my single status, and no performance of aristocratic superiority. The illusion had been completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, baseline truth of who they actually were when the stolen safety net was pulled out from under them. I set my plastic fork down, looking at the three of them across the card table. "I am glad you are working, Vivienne," I said, my voice level and calm. "I am glad you are stable, Mom. I want you to understand something clearly. I am not cutting you out of my life. You are my family. But the bank is closed forever. I will never be your financial safety net again. If you fall, you must find a way to get back up on your own power." Arthur looked down at his paper plate, a slow, deliberate nod of submission rolling through his shoulders. "We know, Nadine," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "We understand." For the first time in 7 years, the silence in the room didn't feel like a prelude to incoming hostile fire. It felt like accountability. I stepped out of the Tacoma apartment complex at 2100, the crisp, cold night air hitting my face like an absolute shock to my system. I walked to my vehicle, my movements fluid, my posture entirely unburdened. The physical knot that had occupied my stomach since my 25th year had completely unraveled. On my drive back north toward Seattle, I made a conscious, tactical choice to take a minor detour. I pulled off the highway and drove past the gated entrance of our old Lake Oswego neighborhood. I rolled the window down, letting the damp Oregon night air wash over the steering wheel as I idled outside the iron gates of the colonial estate. There it was, the monument to Arthur's fraudulent empire. The manicured lawns were already overgrown, choked with wild weeds and damp northwest moss. Driven deep into the center of the front grass was a massive, weather-beaten wooden sign with a bright red banner stretching across the top. Banco WNED/foreclosure enforced. I sat there in the idling car, staring at the peeling paint of the dark house. I waited for a surge of vindictiveness, a flash of triumph, or a lingering echo of anger to validate the years I had lost. I felt absolutely nothing. The house was no longer an intimidating fortress of patriarchal judgment. It was just a hollow pile of rotting timber, moldy drywall, and bad debt. It was a physical manifestation of a profound truth I had finally forged in the mud of my own survival. When you build your personal comfort entirely on someone else's forced sacrifice, your foundation is made of sand. The collapse isn't a tragedy, it is a mathematical certainty. I put the vehicle in gear and drove away, turning my back on Lake Oswego for the final time. As I hit the open expanse of the I-5 corridor, the brilliant, sharp white and blue lights of the Seattle skyline opened up before me, reflecting off the dark, endless mirror of the Puget Sound. This was my city. This was the clean, quiet life I had earned with my own calloused hands, paid for with my own labor, and defended with my own voice. I adjusted my mirrors, gripped the wheel with steady hands, and let my shoulders drop. I didn't need Arthur's gavel to validate my trauma, and I didn't need their permission to be whole. My identity was no longer tied to being the compliant, self-sacrificing daughter who held up the floor so they could dance on it. I was Nadine Foster. I was an operator. I was free. I rolled the window down completely, letting the wind rush into the cabin at 70 miles per hour, and took my first real, deep, and completely unburdened breath in 7 years. When you spend years holding up the floor so that everyone else can dance on it, you eventually forget the basic geometry of a human foundation. We tend to confuse endurance with devotion, convincing ourselves that true love is measured by how much of our own life we are willing to let someone else misplace. But human relationships are not structural debt policies. Dignity cannot be safely bartered away in exchange for a false sense of peace, and respect, true, unshakable respect, never begins by allowing the people around you to shrink your identity into a transaction. It is a quiet, necessary truth of the human experience that our value is never defined by the cages others build for us out of their own expectations or unearned dependencies. Sometimes, the most profound act of resilience isn't continuing to bail out a sinking ship. It is having the clarity to realize that you are the water, you are the boat, and you are entirely capable of swimming to your own shore. True alignment with ourselves only begins when we stop searching for validation from the very people who profit from our silence, and accept that a firm boundary isn't a betrayal. It is the baseline of our own freedom. Thank you so much for walking through this narrative journey with me today. It is always a privilege to share these glimpses into the complex, messy, and ultimately triumphant layers of human resilience. If this journey resonated with your own perspective on personal truth and boundaries, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Where are you watching from, and what does true independence mean to you? Don't forget to hit that follow button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so we can keep exploring these deep, authentic human stories together. Until next time, take care of yourself, take a full breath, and keep moving forward on your own path.